What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a retrospective review for the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard. A game I've wanted to get around to taking a look at for quite some time, as this, Battlespire, and a few other older titles are just things I haven't covered on the channel yet in full, despite having played a couple of them, such as Redguard here prior. And with there being a relative lull in game releases over the next few weeks, this and a couple others are what I wanted to fit in here. And with that in mind, Redguard is a unique game in a lot of ways. However, just starting with, I would say probably the most important note, it's also not really a game I would recommend anyone try to play unless they are just truly dedicated either to the Elder Scrolls or just really old games in general, I suppose. And the reason for that is that Redguard is beset by technical problems, even to this day. There is a way to play it without too many issues, but the chances of you running through this with no issues are essentially zero, because even things down to like the way the controls work these days are difficult to deal with. Now, I was able to get this done relatively quickly because, as mentioned, I have played this game before, which meant I already pretty much knew where to go and what to do, but it is actually a game that benefits from some of that experience, or at least not going in fully blind, simply because there are some common pitfalls that will make it more difficult than it really needs to be. And we're obviously going to get into that over the course of this review. But first, I want to mention one of my main complaints with this game, which has nothing to do with the technical stuff, and that is simply that they are still charging money for it. So if you are unaware, The Elder Scrolls 2 Daggerfall is just free. You can go grab that pretty much anywhere, and it is not going to cost you a dime, and then with that free game, you can then go get Daggerfall Unity and have an absolutely grand time, potentially for hundreds of hours even, and it's not going to cost you a dime. And yet somehow Redguard, as well as Battlespire, which are barely younger, they are still charging like $5 for, which isn't a huge complaint, but it's just something that's always bothered me. And I say that as somebody who has bought both the Steam and GOG versions, which will come up here in a moment. Let's talk broad strokes first, however. To describe Redguard is very simple. It is a game with a surprisingly great story, but beset by technical problems, as mentioned, that make it borderline unplayable and kind of literally unplayable in some instances. Now, in some ways, I do think that kind of hilariously does make it a really great game for YouTube in particular. This is a game that it's really fun to watch people struggle with, more so than it is to actually play the game. And on top of that, you can experience the best thing about it via videos and the like, that being the story. And there is, again, just not a ton of reason to put yourself through playing it, with its just god-awful controls, the many bugs you may well run into with any version of it, the large potential for softlocks, all of the potentially game-breaking bugs, etc. And I'm going to try to break down all of that and more over the course of this review. But there is actually another thing I wanted to talk about in this section, which is that one of the reasons you don't really see anything like Redguard in the Elder Scrolls universe anymore isn't really much of a mystery, because Redguard was part of a series of like spin-offs for the series that is actually the second in what was planned to be at least a trilogy, I guess you could say, that being 3 games, not necessarily connected, but the first one was actually Battlespire. And unfortunately, the 1-2 punch of both Battlespire and Redguard pretty much flailing after the release of Daggerfall, as Daggerfall released in 96, Battlespire released in 97, and then Redguard released in 98. But with both Battlespire and Redguard failing out of the gate, Bethesda was perilously close to going out of business, which they've talked about in many places, and is kind of what led them to go all in on Morrowind, which happened to be a success and saved them from that financial crisis, but at a cost many might not be aware of. You see, as I mentioned, there were 3 games kind of in this little side series planned, with the third one being the Eye of Argonia. This is actually referenced in a few places, in Redguard specifically, but also later games, and was of course meant to be set in Blackmarsh around the gym, the Eye of Argonia, which had some plans already drawn up, which is why we know about it. Slightly less known, however, is brief mentions of a game set in Elsewhere, Paradise Sugar, which was meant to focus around the Khajiit, and in particular the family of a crime boss known as Sarathra, who also features in Redguard. Redguard. So ultimately, the failure, albeit, admittedly deserved, of Battlespire and Redguard put Bethesda down the road of Morrowind, Oblivion, and Skyrim for both good and ill, I suppose. Next up, the big thing I want to talk about here is the technical side of things, which we are going to have to spend a longer than usual amount of time on discussing many of the pitfalls of this game. One, first and foremost, you may be asking yourself if there are any mods, etc. that you can help out with this, and the answer is mostly no. There is technically an unofficial patch, but almost everything that patch actually does is restore cut dialogue and stuff, some of which introduces bugs of its own. And so while that does exist, it's not gonna help you in the way you may well be thinking of an unofficial patch from other games, etc. However, as I mentioned, there are two different versions of this depending on where you buy it from, Steam or GOG. These basically being a software renderer or the glide renderer that would have came with the packaged physical version. So if you actually managed to buy the physical version of this way back in the day and went to install it, it would ask you which version you would like to use. And while you're obviously not exactly going to come across many physical discs of Redguard these days, Steam has the software rendered version, whereas GOG uses that glide renderer. This is important because the glide version that you can get from GOG is both going to give you less problems because it plays nicer with hardware in general, in addition to having a better overall resolution, which makes the graphics look a little sharper, old as the title is. But really, the main reason I would recommend the GOG version is just because it will give you less problems than the Steam version will. This particular run-through of this game, I ran into maybe a couple of crashes, and that was the worst of the problems. However, it can in fact get quite a bit worse than that. And before I start detailing those, you should probably know that as old as this game is, it also has a console. If you hit default F12, it will open that console, and you have a few commands here and there that you can input to help you get out of situations or get you unstuck, that kind of thing. And if you want to play this for yourself, I would obviously recommend you familiarize yourself with that. That said, let's go ahead and talk about the game's many other problems, starting with controls. They are bad, but not necessarily for the reason you would think. They're not bad because they're bad, though they are bad to be clear. They're mostly bad because they're inconsistent. You see, one of the big problems people will have is that on occasion, Cyrus, our main character here, doesn't stop when you stop hitting the movement keys. He will continue for a couple of seconds, and this can cause you to fall off edges and the like. Now here's the catch. It doesn't always do that. Sometimes you stop moving and you stop on a dime. And the inconsistency there, combined with the game's necessary platforming sections, failing which just leads to instant death, and you're already in for a rough time for a lot of people, as you would probably imagine. And that's before we start talking about how terrible the keybinds are. You can rebind a ton of the keys, like it defaults to arrow key movement, and you can rebind that to WASD and several other keys in order to make the game a bit more, I would say, friendly to what you might be used to these days. But realistically, that's the least of this game's problems, because the other issues are the more serious stuff, starting with the crashes. So when you hit escape to bring up the menu to say save your game, and you will want to save as often as possible, by the way, because of some of the issues we're about to talk about. But hitting escape to bring up the menu can be one of the things that crashes the game, unfortunately, which means sometimes you do a thing, you go to save, and the game crashes. It can also occasionally just crash randomly due to various memory errors. There are a few workarounds there, most of which involve messing around with the game's actual file structure, which, various people may not feel comfortable doing. Unfortunately, the game might also crash on you when you go to pick up certain items. If that still wasn't enough for you, occasionally certain areas of the game will simply stop loading at about 95%. This is one of the bigger issues you can run into because it will affect save files like just across the board. And what happens if you run into this one is that one of the reasons you want to save a ton is if that happens to you, what you'll likely have to do is go back through your saves and simply test at which point that area stopped loading and go back to that save and simply start playing again from there. If you are, again, more comfortable messing around with the in-game files, it's possible to then go into that save file and copy some of the necessary information from that save to a newer save where you were farther along to potentially fix the issue. But that's really just a maybe. And then there are, let's say, infrequent bugs like the void. One of the problems you can run into with Redguard is just falling into nothingness. This can usually happen from the Goblin Cave or the City harbor, and while those are the most frequent, there's also a handful of less frequent things. It's possible to get stuck transitioning from swimming to going onto land. It's possible for the game to freeze up as Cyrus goes to talk to an NPC. You'll usually do like a shuffle to get into the correct position for the conversation to take place, but if something blocks you as that is happening, it can also break the game. And while you'd probably be hard-pressed to actually tell, there are also combat bugs where you can just no longer defend yourself. That one can be fixed by just restarting. There's a portion of the game where you get transformed into a gremlin. If you happen to have had a consumable item equipped when that happened and you hit the use key while as a gremlin, it can also completely freeze and break the game for you. So needless to say, there are a lot of technical problems with this game, which is part of the reason why most people never get around to finishing it, despite the fact that it's actually a relatively short and simple title. As an early action adventure, there's not a lot of things like progression systems or even much in the way barring you from doing what you need to do, because the story is short in the sense that there's really only like 3 main leads you need to track down in the game's little open world island of Stros Mackay before you can then tackle the actual end game. And so if it wasn't for the simple technical mess that is this title, it would be a relatively simple game for people to run through. And it's a shame that people can't, because what you're missing out on there is, again, a story that is probably better than you would imagine given the state of the rest of the game. Now, I will say I don't want to oversell it. There's a reason that the game is not remembered as fondly as, say, Planescape Torment, etc., but it does genuinely have its moments, and you can see why the character Cyrus the Redguard was somebody they settled on. In particular, there's a big speech partway through the game that he just nails, and that combined with, let's say, high-effort voice acting, if not necessarily highly skilled voice acting, makes for a story that's probably pretty memorable if you've ever played through it for yourself. But let's actually talk about some of the background there. The Elder Scrolls adventure Redguard takes place on the island of Stros Mackay. In particular, though, it takes place shortly after Tiber Septim's Third Empire has taken over Hammerfell. However, Hammerfell's king died. This sparked a civil war between factions within Hammerfell, the Crowns and the Forebears. The Crowns are the ones who support their own sovereignty, and thus the king's son, Prince Aetor. The Forebears, on the other hand, welcome the, let's say, progress and innovation of the Empire and are on the side of Tiber Septim. In the wake of this civil war, following the King of Hammerfell's death, Tiber Septim naturally backs the Forebears and pushes the Crowns and their resistance all the way back to the Isle of Stros Mackay, which, if you're unaware of the geography, is a decent way away from the mainland. And in fact, the recent last stand of the Crowns is basically the setup for the political situation on Stros Mackay. You see, the Crowns have just lost spectacularly. In what was to be their final stand, Prince Aetor was actually crushed by a dragon, Naphalilaris, alongside the assassin working for Lord Rickton, and that's actually when we show up, a couple of months after this has been won. The Empire has taken over Stros Mackay, Lord Rickton has been installed as the provisional governor, and they are doing everything they can to repress any sentiment of the rebellion that is left in the form of the Restless League, who is still here serving the Crowns. However, they are greatly diminished and mostly just trying to bide their time. And then comes our character, Cyrus the Redguard. So Cyrus has been away from Hammerfell for some time. In fact, he starts the game out in Wayrest, some ways away. Cyrus has been there working for a crime boss known as Sarathra, a Khajiit, who passes on word to Cyrus that a letter came in for him talking about how his sister Azara is missing. She has seemingly been gone for some time, nobody knows where she is, and they're basically looking to you as a last resort. You haven't talked to your sister Azara since you killed her husband and left, being a bit of a wanderer since. And so this family drama is what calls you back to Stros Mackay, initially pretty unconcerned with the situation around the Crown's Forebears and the Civil War and the Empire and all that. As you might imagine, you're quickly going to get dragged into that, however, because as you will quickly see, your sister Azara was pretty heavily wrapped up in it. Now here's where things get interesting. The story is actually somewhat non-linear. I would say there are basically 3 story threads that you need to follow to their conclusion in order to take on the endgame. There is the sort of laid out in front of you main path, yes, but there are also 2 other side quests, so to speak, that you have to do. The game does not, technically speaking, have quests, though, just so you know. However, I will say I do think they could have structured this a tiny bit better, because the main quest that they actually sort of hand feed to you is probably the thread you want to save for last. You're probably better off doing the other 2 first, and the reason for that is that the first quest in like the main plot you're given sends you to the Isle of Nagasta. So Nagasta is a slowed necromancer nearby who, as all slowed tend to do, dabbles with raising the undead. He has an amulet that he wants you to deliver to the provisional governor, Lord Rickton. Now, once you turn that amulet over to Lord Rickton, every guard after that quest will be hostile, and they are everywhere, and they are all over the island, and they're going to be chasing you constantly, and as a result, it's really best to wait on that until you do everything else, and then kind of start that quest, and then just beeline it towards the end of the game from that point. Otherwise, you're making it more difficult than it really needs to be, especially in combination with the many technical problems we've already discussed. But it is in talking to that slowed necromancer, Nagasta, you learn a few interesting things pretty much straight away, though keep in mind almost any of this information you could come across at different times. But Nagasta will just straight up tell you that he's put a soul snare over the island of Stros Mackay, and basically what this is a mass soul trap covering the entire island, and that anytime anybody dies, he automatically traps their soul, which then fuels his necromancy, of course. Now there's a few ways around this. In particular, the Temple of Archay and the town is actually making sure people's souls do not get caught in this, but anybody not in town, like for instance the Yakudans nearby, are at great risk of this happening to them, and that is a bit of a problem. When the Yakudan matriarch's son dies unexpectedly, she has to make sure that his soul does not get trapped in this soul snare, but that also reveals that she is a master of soul magic, which is going to come in handy later, which is one of the side plot threads you have to deal with. The other one being that an archmage also died in all the nastiness before the game starts, and it just so happens that while he was not a particularly accomplished actual magic user, what he was good at enchanting things, or at least finding things that are enchanted at the very least. He had a number of very powerful artifacts, not least of which was his ring. A ring that could break somebody out of stasis, and when you recover that and return the journal of the priest who went down there looking for it in the Goblin Caves to the Temple of Archay, it is revealed to you that while Prince Ator did in fact die in that battle a while back, they found his body, and it's been kept in stasis at the temple there pretty much the whole time, and they actually had to do it that way because nothing could break the stasis until you found that Archmage's ring, which is capable of doing the job. Now, once you solve those 2 side plots, some of which involves a whole bunch of dwarven ruins, fighting a dwarven colossus, fixing a dwarven observatory, which is all pretty cool, you will eventually turn your head towards the main plot. Now, when you first arrive on the island, you're likely going to talk to Tobias at the inn nearby, who will give you the lay of the land and set a bunch of stuff up for you, and basically tell you to start asking around, which is then what would lead you to getting the amulet from Nagasta and delivering it to Lord Rickton. Now, when Lord Rickton essentially refuses to answer your questions about Azara, he does, however, let some information slip, that she was in fact involved with the Restless League, who are known crowns, people supporting the rebels in this case, and Prince Ator. So once you manage to escape your shackles, by which get out of the dungeon you were tossed into, your job becomes tracking down the Restless League, finding these people and seeing what they knew about your sister. Eventually, through a convoluted series of methods, you'll find a way of contacting them. Basically, at the lighthouse down south in St. Port, you will flash a signal causing a boat to pull up, and as long as you have the prerequisite items to give that person to trust you, they'll take you to the Restless League, where they will in fact confirm Asara's involvement, but you'll also find her journal, which gives you the rest of the information. You see, we already know that Prince Ator did not in fact die, but his body has been held in stasis at the temple, and so what Azara was trying to do when she disappeared was take a soul gem with Prince Ator's soul in it when he died, to the necromancer Nagasta, hoping that Nagasta would be willing to set it right. And so now we need a means of confronting Nagasta, and we do that by finding the Flask of Lilandril. That's going to see us being temporarily turned into a gremlin by the current Archmage, who's doing everything he can to stay in the Empire's good graces, as he himself has aspirations of joining the Battlespire, which, as you'll recall, released prior to this game. But once you learn about Azara and the Soul Gem and everything, you may well think to go to the Mages Guild, who will deal with things like Soul Gems, and ask them about it, which is where the Archmage there will turn you into this gremlin. And the only place you can actually go as a gremlin is to the prison where one of the Mages Guild members has been imprisoned for helping Azara, and he gives you the information about the flask that you'll need, as well as a map to hopefully find it before he is promptly assassinated by Lord Richten's assassin, Dram, who serves as a bit of a side antagonist, if you will, though not a very good one, to be honest. However, from there you take that map piece, find hopefully other map pieces, though technically this is the only one you have to go get, and then find the Flask of Lilandril, which is buried near Saintsport. This flask is special because what it does is absorb and reflect magic. Once we have that flask, we can go join up with Nagasta, who promptly attacks you, of course, when you discover your sister there. Not before, of course, he explains that your sister bartered her soul for the resurrection, so to speak, of Ator by putting his soul back in his body. Nagasta is pretty straightforward in telling you that he hasn't gotten around to actually doing this, and the way he sees it, he's got all the time in the world to do it, so he's not really concerned about it, and he's not planning to let your sister go, and couldn't even if he wanted to, because he took her soul and traded it to the Daedric Lord Clavicus Vile. At this point, you're going to get into a fight with Nagasta, and it's really simple. Like most of the actual boss fights, it's a little gimmicky in that you just have the Flask of Lilandril equipped and reflect his spells back at him until he dies. At which point you're tasked with solving a little puzzle to open a portal to the realm of Clavicus Vile, who taunts you 6 ways to Sunday before eventually agreeing to free your sister's soul if you can solve a little puzzle, which is like the Knights and Knaves logic puzzle, where you have one guard that lies, one guard that tells the truth, and you simply ask them what the other guard would tell you and then do the opposite of that. That puzzle's been around forever. But in so doing, you will have freed your sister. Now at this point, the game sort of stops you until you go complete those other 2 side quests. That being helping Saban with her son's soul, as well as finding the Archmage's ring and learning where Prince Aetor's body is. But there is, technically speaking, a couple more things you have to do. Now, once you've saved Azara, she's going to give you a key to the catacombs which you already escaped from when you delivered the amulet to Lord Richten, because as your sister Azara will tell you, that amulet that you delivered earlier in the game was in fact the soul gem with Prince Aetor's soul. It's being kept in the palace treasury now, and you get the key to go into that treasury, because if you hadn't pieced it together by now, your sister and Prince Aetor were lovers, and simply put, you need to go get that soul gem, so we can save the day, of course. Now this involves going through another dungeon, the final one, technically speaking, and ultimately fighting the red dragon Nephalalargus, which, again, because most of the boss fights are gimmicky, is very easy. You just light your sword in the brazier and then slash at it. It will die pretty quickly, like shockingly so for a dragon that no man could defeat according to all of the build up to that moment. But either way, once you've got the soul gem, you've completed those other 2 side quests, you can go to the witch mother Saban, explain to her the situation, bring her to the temple where Prince Aetor's body is. With the soul gem in your possession, Saban will try to reunite the soul in the soul gem with Prince Aetor's body, but it doesn't go quite according to plan. Rather, the soul does not choose to return to its body, but rather it chooses to inhabit the sword. Now at this point, the Restless League, also showing up and preparing to attack the provisional governor, catching them unaware, are very defeated, only for what is easily the best part of the entire story to take place when Cyrus, suddenly inspired by these events he has witnessed and been a part of, gives an incredibly rousing speech to the Restless League, encouraging them to finish this once and for all by taking the fight to Richten, and pointing out that Aetor didn't do this on accident. He chose to come back as a sword, as both a symbol of fighting for what they believe in, but also the fact that everyone else seems to have put their swords down when they should have been picking them up, and it is genuinely a really great speech. Again, best part of the story by far. At that point, though, as you would expect, you pretty much raid the palace, solve a couple more puzzles, before fighting off both Dram as well as Richten on a dwarven airship that gets blown up in spectacular style, and with the Empire Empire pretty thoroughly repelled from the island of Stros-Makai, we then get an end scene with Izara both leading Stros-Makai but also making favorable deals with the Empire as they attempt to rebuild what is left of the place. So all in all, the story of the Elder Scrolls Adventures Redguard is the best thing about it by far, but also I think a story that is painfully trapped by a game that is a bit of a technical mess. However, one thing that actually I think really sells all of that story is, again, some of that voice acting that is high effort, if not exactly highly skilled. Every NPC you talk to has a wealth of conversation options that you can pick from, and as you gain more knowledge and learn about things, you could potentially ask them simply by talking to them or going through the other story beats, etc. They'll have even more to say. Most NPCs that you can talk to have a mountain of exposition. The game covers interesting lore like the Slowed, which haven't been in too many other games. One of the very rare instances of us seeing a proper living dragon outside of course, Skyrim and its plotline, and some honestly compelling political intrigue on top of all of that. So again, it's just a shame that most people won't experience it for themselves, but luckily that's what videos and Let's Plays, etc. like this are for, that have been kicking around for a while. There are ways to experience that story even if you don't necessarily want to experience the game per se. Now, normally this is where I would go into the progression portion of the video, but as I mentioned, Redguard doesn't really have progression systems. You start the game with basically all the resources and upgrades that you're going to get. You do technically get the sword upgrade from when you get the soul sword, and it does in fact deal more damage and everything, but as far as like straight character upgrades go, that's pretty much it. Everything else is really just about acquiring gold and then using it to buy various goods and services and then interacting with things and just the general gameplay of it all. And so what we're going to do is freely explore the island of Stros-Makai, delve dungeons, solve puzzles, do a little bit of platforming, and generally, or at least hopefully anyway, learn about the game as we go. Now, one thing you'll notice hopefully pretty quickly is that you can actually combine things here and there. So one of the early ways you can do this is by getting yourself a bunch of healing. You have access to a variety of potions throughout the game, mainly healing potions, strength potions, iron skin, deal more damage, take less incoming damage, that kind of thing. And you can buy those from the Mages Guild or find them. An alternative, however, is to buy aloe from the general goods vendor, known as Garrick, and then go get water from the well in the middle of town, put the aloe in the water, and then get a glass bottle from the alchemist shack, which has been abandoned and beat up outside of town. And then once you put that aloe water in the glass bottle, you effectively get about 20 healing potions for like 10 gold, which is incredibly cheap compared to 25 a piece over at the Mages Guild. And to take that a bit farther, speaking of your gold, you can only carry 500 gold pieces at a time, usually in 5 gold piece increments as a matter of fact. Though some quests, and you can do these again pretty much immediately, will reward hundreds of gold, and it's really easy to have gold and buy all the potions, and your inventory for potions can be expansive, and so with those potions and the easy access to healing, despite the game's terrible combat, you should probably be okay as you move through this. But combining items in that way, or using them in the exact right spot to trigger an effect, is really about as crazy as the gameplay gets. In particular though, you might not realize it or even think about it, but technically speaking, Redguard has a fast travel system. There are shrines of Kinnereth scattered throughout the island, and you can buy canna feathers from Garrick, the general goods vendor, and if you take those feathers to a shrine and use them, it will teleport you to the closest shrine to the direction you are currently facing, which is about as close as you get to fast travel. You also don't start the game with a map. You need to go kill one of the thugs around the island to get one. There are multiple things to be found and dug up via a shovel. You'll also probably want to buy a whole bunch of books and stuff from the book vendor and read those, both for the lore but also to unlock the option to actually use them. Like the Dwarven lore book is necessary to get into one of the dungeons, which then nicely brings us to the dungeons themselves. So the dungeons are basically full of enemies, puzzles, and platforming. While the puzzles are perfectly fine, the rest of it could use some work. Combat's terrible, and we'll get to that in a moment, but unfortunately the platforming is also pretty terrible. Now, one of the things you'll struggle with straight away is just timing your jumps because of the sort of skatey controls that I mentioned. You can get used to that though. There is a way to get pretty reliable jumps. However, that's not the only platforming you need to do. You'll also need to occasionally grab onto ledges and shuffle across them, climb up and down ropes, or, most dangerously, swing across ropes. The ropes can also eventually be done in a very very predictable way, but it takes some practice. You basically want to hang at the very, very bottom and then swing back and forth until you get enough momentum to properly go. But kind of getting a feel for where you're going to go when you jump off of a rope is the tough part. Now, your direction shouldn't be that bad, but like where you are on the rope will decide how far you jump. And considering that if you fail, you usually just die, there's that, of course. So all of that, and then combined with the puzzles as well. There's a handful of puzzles. Most of them aren't too bad. A couple of them are odd, let's say. So personally, I think the rune one in the catacombs is probably my least favorite. There's a weight puzzle in the catacombs as well when you go back for the soul gem. That is probably the most straightforward of all of them. There is a steam valve one in the Dwarven Ruins that you'll need to investigate. That one is mostly just difficult because you don't have a clear picture of the entire puzzle because it's technically across multiple rooms. There's also the scarab puzzle there where you have to arrange pieces of a scarab and kind of turn it into an automaton to hold a chain for you, which will then open up one of the doors to get you to that steam puzzle. And that place can be confusing, as you would expect a Dwemer ruin to be. But another interesting thing about this game, though, is that most of its boss fights are also kind of puzzles. There's really not a whole lot of bosses who you just fight straight up just for fun. That's mostly down to the regular enemies. Now, as a result, that makes most of them really easy, like the ogre down in the goblin caves who is guarding the archmage's ring. If you just get him to hit one of the pillars, he dies pretty much immediately. The dwarven colossus at the end of the dwarven ruins. This one is kind of annoying, but what you're trying to aim for is hitting him in his exposed left ankle where all his wiring and stuff is, and if you do that enough times, he dies. You fight the dragon by heating up your sword and then just stabbing it repeatedly, and that fight's actually really easy as long as it doesn't breathe fire at you. You fight Nagasta by reflecting all of his attacks back at him, etc. Really the only straight up boss fight is Dram and Richten at the very end. The real challenge is, of course, doing that with all of the technical problems. But finally, I want to talk a bit about combat, because it's easy to write combat off in this game, and to be clear, you probably should write it off. It's not good. However, there is more to it than immediately meets the eye. Now, some of the reason for that is that even if you know about this stuff, it also doesn't play super well anyway, but basically you're going to pull out your sword and attack your enemies. Now, you can, especially if you have the healing items queued up, which you can activate by just hitting a single hotkey, just kind of flail at enemies until they die. That will get you through the game. Might take a little longer, but it is viable, and to be honest with you, even if you know about this stuff, it's probably going to feel that way anyway. But you actually have multiple different attacks, and so do your enemies. You can do a single, double, or triple slash, but the longer you extend that combo for, the more you lower your defenses, which can lead to you getting hit. There is also a thrust and a lunge attack, where you dive forward, again exposing yourself, but typically breaking through a defense potentially, and having a bigger range at that. But there are also strength and iron skin potions. These make you either deal more damage or reduce incoming damage. By the way, don't use the strength potion with the soul sword. There's a bug there. You won't actually get extra damage. It will reduce your damage, but with your regular sword, it works fine. Now, the thing is, you're supposed to try to mitigate incoming damage. It's just that the system and the controls and the feel of it feel terrible. So if you want to just flail, like I mentioned, totally fine. But you do actually have the ability to defend against these attacks. There is an auto defend, which should be on by default, but it's F7 to toggle it on and off. And this should prevent enemies from hitting you if you're facing them with your sword out and everything. But you can also, with that on, press the Alt key to more actively defend and block. Now, it's also possible to sort of sidestep with the Shift key and moving left or right. This will allow you to potentially sidestep attacks that would then open up the defenses of the enemy you are fighting. This is hard to pull off because their attacks are not particularly well telegraphed, and the exact hitboxes and stuff aren't great either. But the way combat is supposed to work here is you basically trying to read what the enemy is doing, sidestepping out of the way, and then attacking their weak points and the like. It's just that in reality, what it tends to come down to is you just flailing your sword at each other until they die, and you hopefully having enough healing items for it not to matter. And then, like I mentioned, all of the boss fights typically have their little gimmicks that don't really use much of this system at all, or at least it doesn't really matter anyway. So like I said, a little bit more to combat than you would probably think, but also pretty terrible all around. Now, I like to do a Steam Deck section in my reviews. You may well be wondering if it is possible to play this on the Steam Deck, and the answer is yes, technically, but for whatever reason, the Steam Deck does not like this game. So even if you play it on the Steam version, it's not going to run super well for you. It is officially unsupported, though you can get it to play. It just gets really bad FPS for some reason, in addition to all of its other problems on the Steam Deck in particular. So that is a thing, I guess. Which then brings me to my positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So on the positive side, basically just the story. Cyrus as a character is pretty great, incredibly charismatic. His speech at the end, the story is the reason you even try to play this game, let's all be honest. The negatives, on the other hand, are all the reasons you're going to give up on playing this game, which is basically all of the rest of it. The terrible combat, the terrible platforming, the terrible controls, the abysmal technical state, which may well keep you from playing it literally in the sense of making it unplayable in some instances. And on that note, as we bring this to the conclusion here, obviously I don't really recommend anybody play this. Unless you are just really dedicated to the craft, I mean, there's really no reason to do so when you can look up videos of the story itself on YouTube. Those videos exist, and you can get the best thing about this game from those videos. But, as I mentioned at the top of the video, it also drives me crazy that Daggerfall is free and they're still charging money for this, and I say that as somebody who has bought it twice. This and Battlespire, as a matter of fact. I think both of those should be free. I can't imagine they're making any money off of these at this point. And at the same time, I think making it free might encourage more people to put up with the absolute hot mess that is the rest of this game in order to experience some of that story for themselves. But to be clear, hard to recommend anybody do that either. And so for me, at least, when it comes to Redguard, I think it is an interesting look at what might have been. It's obviously in the news constantly for various reasons across the years that we haven't gotten a mainline entry to the Elder Scrolls in 15 years as of the time of this video here in 2026. And while we have gotten content via like the Elder Scrolls Online, which dives into a lot of great lore, I also don't like multiplayer stuff, and that's really not for me. But I think Redguard, Battlespire, and those odd little side games like this hint at a future we could have gotten where they use the incredibly impressive world of Tamriel to tell more stories about side adventures and characters like this, as opposed to the mainline entries, which are all about freedom and, fitting yourself into the world. Now, I'll be perfectly honest, I don't know that that would have been the best thing for the series. It's just a glimpse at what might have been, and I find that intriguing, and its historical significance, especially in terms of like early 3D games, etc. More than anything, Redguard is just a novelty for a lot of different reasons. And as a YouTuber who loves to cover obscure novelties, which is not an insignificant reason this channel exists to begin with, I'll admit I have a soft spot for it, even if I do think it is a pretty terrible game. But that is pretty much going to do it for this particular video. Certainly hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting. All of that, if you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.